how do you define success when it comes to anything related to birth or the postpartum period? Because there are so many variables that despite all the preparation we might do, none of us have a crystal ball and none of us can predict outcomes, especially with so many barriers that get in the way of both birth and breastfeeding. So this week, I decided to bring on a special guest, Jen Walts, who's a doula and a childbirth educator, so that we could have a discussion about how people can empower themselves to feel successful and define success for themselves by taking ownership of their own birth and postpartum experiences, so that no matter what the outcome is, no matter what twists and turns, as Jen likes to say, come up during birth and postpartum, that you feel like you had agency, which is really how we can define success. So enjoy this special quick hit episode that is not just me, but a conversation with a lovely person who has thought through so many of these things and is helping so many people in her community to find voice and agency as they enter into parenthood. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. Having known only a handful of people who had ever done it and only seeing it up close a couple of times, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a childbirth educator, and an internationally board-certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore the systemic, medical, and cultural barriers that make feeding our babies so difficult, so that you know your baby feeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are. I'm here with Jen Walts of Wind and Water Doula Care, and we wanted to talk a little bit about what people can do to feel more supported during the perinatal period.
Mm.
And you've been working really hard to help your own clients and the people in your community feel more empowered to take ownership of their birth and postpartum journeys. And so I thought you would be a great person to talk to about this.
Thank you. I'm so excited to chat.
Yeah. Before we get into talking about this specifically, do you want to talk a little bit about your doula services and what your philosophy is behind the care that you give?
Sure. So let's see. I am a birth doula and certified hypnobirthing instructor, and those are my main services that I offer. And I also offer postpartum virtual coaching and support, as well as birth story listening and any sort of labor and birth prep sessions that folks want. I'm really a fan of making individualized packages and service offerings that work for what people are looking for too. And my core belief is that I really believe in birth, the physiologic process of birth. But I also know that sometimes physiology goes wrong. And so we need to know what our options are and to feel empowered to make decisions when these unexpected twists and turns happen. So I believe in the process of birth and folks' bodies to do its thing, but I also believe in medicine and alternative options and supporting folks on their unique journeys.
Yeah, especially given that we live in this world where so few people are as supported as they need to
Yes.
feel the safety that they need to feel for their body to do its thing.
Yeah.
So, given all the barriers there are, we definitely need to have other options that aren't just going out into the woods and delivering our babies.
Yeah. I can't say I've supported that kind of birth, but
Not yet.
not yet. Some side of the road births, but that's as close as I've gotten.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So talk a little bit about the types of preparations that you have seen with your clients that you feel really set them up, not for having, I don't want to use the words a successful birth and breastfeeding, because
Right.
success looks different to different people. And it
Right.
doesn't mean like having the birth that is written out in your birth plan,
Yeah.
but rather what are the preparations that people do in the prenatal period that help them come out at the end feeling like, you know what? I did everything I could. I feel empowered by that experience. I made all the best decisions I could in the moment, and I feel proud of
Mm.
that experience, regardless of how the baby was actually delivered.
What you just said is what I always hope to hear when I do a postpartum visit with a family within their first few weeks home with their new baby, to hear them say those words. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. I think what I'm seeing in terms of preparation and landing in that place that you just mentioned of feeling empowered and feeling like they found agency through the whole process, regardless of twists and turns. I'm seeing some patterns. One is that they're able to navigate the twists and turns with tools that they prepared themselves with to calm and regulate their nervous systems. So that may be breathing techniques, that may be visualization, it might be that they've worked really hard with a therapist or another energetic healing practitioner to just stack themselves with some tools so that when anxiety or any emotion arises that kind of takes them out of their body, that they have tools to turn to and strategies that work for them and their birth companion. That's one piece. And then I also see folks setting themselves up for incredible support on the other side of baby's arrival, whether that be with their feeding journey or people dropping off meals or making sure they have a pelvic floor specialist that they can connect with, thinking about, okay, who's my support now? Who is my support team during labor and birth? And then who is my support team going to be after this baby arrives? And who am I going to turn to in the middle of the night? And who am I going to turn to during the day? And just having those
Mm.
go-to networks in place so that when they are inevitably sleep deprived, that they don't have to create this network of people to turn to, that they've already got it stacked for themselves. And then the last thing is keeping their voice at the center of the experience. So I think that a lot of prep work goes into that in a number of different ways. It could be a really quality childbirth ed class where they understand the physiology of labor and birth. They understand what their options are. They've really shopped around for specific providers that manage labor in a way that aligns with the kind of experience they hope to have, and practicing advocacy in their prenatal appointments, asking really good questions. I think like people who know how to ask really good questions and take in that information so they can make good decisions for their bodies and their babies are going to feel like they did everything they could. I just thought of one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that folks who are willing to have reflective, critical conversations with themselves and their support team, and if they have a birth companion or a doula, just like willing to go deeper. And I know that sounds like such an elusive thing, but willing to ask themselves, okay, what am I committed to here? What are the values that I want to show up in this experience? Instead of what am I attached to? Because if I'm attached to a certain idea or vision of what birth might look like, then that's probably my ego like guiding what I want that to look like. But if it's more about commitment, like what are the values, even if I hoped for an unmedicated birth, but I end up for physiologic reasons having to have a surgical birth. What are the values I want to be in that room, in that space? How do I want to be treated? And how do I find a team who's going to provide that for me and my family?
Yeah. Yeah, I want to go back to something you said about people setting themselves up for support, like
Yeah.
during the birth and then after the birth. And I know maybe the people that you get to interact with Maybe it's a little like it's only a cross section of the population because these are people who are setting themselves up
Right.
for an intentional experience by either taking a hypnobirthing childbirth education course or by having a birth doula on their support team. However, something that I hear from people all the time, both clients and guests of the podcast, is man, I wish that I had been less concerned about setting up the nursery and getting all the clothing washed and worrying about all the stuff I needed to buy and more concerned about what it was actually going to feel like in the postpartum period and
Right.
then setting myself up to mitigate for that. And so, what have you seen people do in the prenatal period that has helped with that? You talked about knowing who you're going to call both in the day and in the night. Is there anything else that you've seen people do besides just know who the people are that they're going to reach out to during those stressful times?
Definitely. I have seen folks put lists on their refrigerator of what people can do when they come over instead of holding the baby because we usually don't need people to do that for us.
Mhm.
I've seen people do that. I have seen people put meal trains together for themselves or have a friend do it. I have also seen I've seen people share their registry with me as a birth doula and say, "Be honest with me. What do I really not need?" And usually I'll respond back with a whole list of 10 things that I really don't think they need. And then I'll add, hey, why don't you add in your registry a section for people to donate to birth doula care, to childbirth education, to lactation support, to prenatal massage, whatever sort of like modalities you want to turn to for your holistic support through this process prenatally and postpartum. People want to help and they just don't necessarily have an avenue or know how. And if we're sending a registry link out with like cute onesies and things to dock our babies in, those are the things that people are familiar with. And that's what they're going to purchase. But if you add at the top of that registry a little link to donate to something that really matters to your family and is going to make a huge difference in your support, I think we will start to see people doing that more often. And it excites me as a possibility. So I'm just going to keep sharing that something that folks
Yes.
can do.
Last night, as a family, we had the rare opportunity to just have one child at home. We had not eaten dinner yet, and it was getting pretty late, but we asked him, "It's just the three of us. What would you like to do?" And my son said he wanted to take a walk at a nearby reservoir. And neither my husband and I were stressed out about this because we had a refrigerator full of Feast and Fettle, which had delivered home cooked meals right to our front door that we knew when we came home from our walk, all we would have to do was just heat and serve it. So off we went on our walk right around sunset around the reservoir. It was beautiful, just the three of us and our dog. And then we came home, and within 15 minutes, we had the most delicious coconut crusted cod and roasted cauliflower. And we ate it while we played Uno together. And the cleanup was so easy. And it made our evening so amazing after a full day of work and allowed us to connect with our child. And this is why I am so happy that Feast and Fettle is a partner of the podcast, because I truly believe that anything that allows families to spend more time together and less time worrying about all the things they need to do, like getting dinner on the table, is something I can get behind. So if you would like to see what Feast and Fettle can do for your family, go to feastandfettle.com and use my code MILK to get $30 off your first week's order, and let somebody else do the cooking for you and just go take that walk. If you want to have less anxiety and more confidence so that your parenting journey can feel like you always wanted it to feel, then go to my website right now so that you can have a person by your side who not only knows how you feel, but who combines my expertise of lactation with your expertise of your body and your baby to help you make the next right step in your lactation journey, because that's all you really need to do is make the next right step. And right now, that next right step is going to my website, www.quavinbirthservices.com. And I can't wait to see your name pop up in my inbox or on my phone, on my text messages. Talk to you soon. Yes, absolutely. And there are gift registries that have that built in.
Yes.
That people can find. Yeah, but definitely that needs to be on your mind. If you cannot afford lactation care, if you cannot afford postpartum doula care, if you can't afford to buy some takeout for a few weeks, which I totally get, this stuff is expensive and we live in a society that does not provide equitable healthcare for all people, then figure out a way to get the people who want to buy things for you that kind of stuff.
The other thing that I'm seeing people do for folks who are having like a second or third child, it's harder to carve out time to prepare. And I have seen some families recently reach out for birth doula support so that they can have a carved out time to dedicate their brains to preparing for labor, birth, postpartum. And I love that because it's a space that's dedicated to them in their prenatal visits, someone who's going to ask them questions and get them thinking about the kind of headspace that they're hoping to get to as they approach birthing this child. And I think that's a really great tool that people can turn to.
Yeah, I think that's great. And often I see this when people did not have the experience they wanted the first time. And then they're like, oh, I really need to figure this out because I experienced trauma, or I did not feel like my voice was heard, or I did not feel agency the first time. So I would like to take my power back in this second experience.
Definitely. And a lot of birth story listening sessions that I do for families, I often ask folks like, where is there still friction in your story when you think about it, and like where or to what extent did you feel heard during your experience? And often the answer is I didn't, or I didn't feel very heard, and then I typically say, tell me more, or ask like a why question. And they might say something like, I didn't know what my options were. I didn't know what questions I could ask. I didn't feel like I had time to make a decision. And so that redemptive experience that you're talking about, I think comes into play for folks who have experienced previous layers of trauma in labor, birth, a feeding journey, because then they're like, wait a minute, I can do this whole thing and think of it more as like a learning quest and stack myself with a team of support so that my voice will be at the center of the process.
And how great if people can recognize that's a possibility before they've had that less than ideal experience where they didn't feel heard.
And I do think that some of that may come from the fact that we don't hear a lot of positive birth stories or a lot of positive feeding stories. And like you said, success and positive are like those are tricky words. I think positive birth story to me means like someone felt empowered, someone felt like their voice was truly central to their experience and they were heard, and they were the person who made the next move.
Yeah. So I've heard stories of people who I'm actually quite surprised talk about losing their voice during the birth experience in particular, and saying, I couldn't find my voice to say what I wanted or needed in that moment. And so tell me, what are some of the things that you do with your clients to help them practice keeping their voice in those moments when they might be more prone to not speak up, when they feel like the train is moving and they're just on it instead of driving the train themselves.
Yeah. I bring this up in a number of spaces. If I have someone who's working with me as just their birth doula, I will bring this up in a prenatal conversation and just get real with them about how, regardless of birthing location, they are going to have to advocate for themselves at some point because it is their body that's doing the thing, and some people around them are managing the process. And hopefully they've found themselves in a place that aligns with the values that they have and how they want it to be managed. But I think I share with them a couple of anecdotes. So I might say something like, here are two things that happened in the last year. I'm curious, first of all, like, how does this anecdote land with you? And what would you do? What would you do? And how do you see me as your doula empowering you or encouraging you in those moments? How do you see your birth companion involved in this moment? An example might be something like, someone has a medically necessary induction and they were really hoping to not use synthetic oxytocin, and it was a part of their birth preference, but they now have had to say yes to this tool because it's what's going to be safest for the birther's body and the baby. And the nurse comes in and just continues to up the dosage of it without saying anything. And so I might say something like, how comfortable are you with a provider coming into the room and upping the dosage of a medication into your body without consent? And it just starts a conversation. If some people are like, I guess if that's what they have to do, if that's the protocol, let's do it and let's continue on. And other people are like, ooh, what are my options? What should I do in that moment? And it's room for conversation and hopefully little light bulbs going off that allow them to think about how they might handle similar situations in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it gives people the opportunity to recognize the types of actions which can start to get that train rolling
Right.
without you recognizing that it's rolling. And then before you know it, it's gone and you're just on the ride and you're not driving the train.
Definitely. Or if they've indicated to me in the intake forum that they see themselves as a people pleaser and they're worried about how that's going to impact their voice and their birth experience, we just do some work thinking about how they can approach that differently and do some practice scenarios where the partner pretends to be the provider and we just talk it through and see what words feel natural to them and just develop some strategies so that they can go into it feeling like they've got more control.
Mhm. Yeah. Why do you think so many people go into the birthing and breastfeeding space? I see this both with the idea of, why do you think so many people go into the birthing and breastfeeding space saying, if it works out,
Mm.
I would like to try an unmedicated birth if it works out. I'd like to try to breastfeed if it works out. Do you think that this is a defense mechanism? Is it a way to keep people from feeling disappointed and keep some distance away from their feelings of loss? Or do you think
Mm.
it's something else?
I think it's so many things. I think it's all I think it's all that you just mentioned. And I think a wing it approach is ultimately going to result in like unnecessary trauma. I think, yeah, that I hear that a lot too. If I'm able to do it, or if it doesn't hurt too much, or if this, then that, if this, then that. I think as a doula, when I hear that, I'm like, ooh, this means there's a little bit of a gap here. There's an area for some conversation and some learning to happen. And then I have to see what kind of learning and resource digging this person is willing to do. And I just ask a lot of questions until we get there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think often people hear so many negative stories about both birth and human milk feeding. It's a way to recognize that they know that this goes wrong for so many people. So how could they possibly be the one that it goes right for?
Mm. Yes, I think that it is a protective measure to wing it. I think that it's like a tricky, it's like a false sense of control to say, I went into it with really low expectations
Mhm.
instead of identifying what things really matter to you and setting yourself up to work with people who you know are going to support you regardless of what happens.
Yeah. However, like Lex Speech, the IBCLC that you and I both adore, she just told her stories and she talks about how not knowing anything with her twins when she gave birth over 20 years ago was
Right.
really her saving grace. Know enough to know what might have been problematic, and so she
Right.
just kept forging ahead. And there are people who completely prepare, have do all the right things, and it still doesn't go the way that they hoped. And I have people who I have to cry with in their room, in
Yeah.
their living rooms, because they so wanted to breastfeed and it just does not go the way that they intended, and they did all the right prep work, and we can't name why it's not going the right way for them. And
Right.
so it does, preparation does not always equal met goals,
Right.
but bringing the right people in to support you can mean that you can process not meeting those goals and expectations, and you can pivot a little more easily
Yes.
when things aren't going the right way. And it's not just you trying to make the decisions, but you have a team of people who are helping you make them.
The moving through grief and the healing process becomes smoother to navigate with that preparation piece. And I'm also a fan of thinking like we learn what we learn when we need to learn it. And so we can't force ourselves to to learn. We can't create experiences to learn through, but we will learn from each of the experiences. So that's something that I'm often remembering when I meet with a client postpartum who had a completely different experience than they had hoped for or preferred. And then the next question is, okay, where are you now with your mind, with your heart, with your body? What support systems do you have in place? What resources do you need? And what is this continued healing going to look like? Really important questions for someone to be asking those families.
Yeah.
I know you ask, I'm sure you ask those questions as a lactation professional too, to just guide them through that next step.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you've guided somebody through their childbirth education, you've been their birth doula, you're ending your time with them until the next time they have a baby. What are the things that they are saying about their preparation that help you to know, once it's all said and done, that yes, they had agency, they found their voice, they, regardless of how their birth experience turned out, they met their goals because they were kept front and center of the.
I just got a couple of messages recently from some folks who birthed in places that they hoped to birth in, but the experience really was layered with challenges. And one message was, I am so glad that we spent so much time talking about birth preferences because I didn't have to think critically in a time where my nervous system wasn't able to. And I thought that was really powerful to hear as a family going through something traumatic, to already have written down or like deeply in heart and deeply in mind what your family prefers is a really great tool to help you move through the unexpected. So that was a recent message. And then another message was from somebody who said that there were more people in the room than they had anticipated. But despite all of the additional people in the room that were required for this specific circumstance, she still felt like her voice was the only one that mattered. And I and she said, I don't think it would have felt that way if I didn't prepare or I didn't choose a team that I trusted. That feels really good to me. I often ask too at the beginning of our time together, what do you think you know about birth? And I write it down. And then sometimes in the postpartum visit, I'll say, okay, fill in the blank. I used to think blank, but now I think blank. And to just name their different understanding about expectations, I think is a really great reminder in their parenting journey to keep returning to over and over again, that things are going to be different than we expect, but if we have tools to move through it, it's most likely going to be smoother for all involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question to add to my toolbox as well. I used to think blank about breastfeeding, but now I think
Yeah.
blank. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming to share your expertise, both as a childbirth educator and as a prolific birth doula who gets to be with so many people during this important time in their lives. And agency is the most critical element to birthing. And what happens in the birthing room impacts feeding and the postpartum period for so long. And so if that agency gets taken away, it can mean way more difficulty for years to come. And if a person feels that agency, it could mean increased self-efficacy, increased feelings of empowerment as they enter that parenthood journey, which can only make things better despite all the barriers there still are in the postpartum period for families.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your time, Lo. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Autonomy in birth and breastfeeding is so important for people getting off to a right start when it comes to parenthood. And something that I try to do with my clients is when I give my recommendations, and specifically when I send my chart notes that give a plan of action after we have met, is I say to my clients, listen, this is what I am recommending. However, I am not living your life. I don't see your baby day in and day out, 24 hours a day. I am not intimately familiar with your body. I don't live in your body. I don't move in your body. I don't feel the feelings in your body that you feel. So I am making recommendations based on this visit or these series of visits that we've had. However, they are just that. And if the next time we talk or meet, you say, you know what, I didn't do those. I didn't do a single one because in the end, when I reevaluated, it didn't work for me. I will say, oh, great. Tell me what did work for you, or tell me what you've been doing or been trying, or tell me where there were pain points so that we can come up with a plan that does work for you. And I'll never get offended by that because in the end, you are the person living your life and you are the one who gets to make the decisions about your body and your baby. So I love having discussions with people like Jen who help clients to find their voice in these scenarios so that they can be interacting with all of their providers in this way. If you have something to say about how your interactions with providers have gone, please join my Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook where we can discuss that. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind you that if you go to feastandfettle.com, you can get $30 off your first week of home cooked meals that get delivered right to your door. You won't regret it. You'll have so much more time to spend with your family by having those meals delivered. So there's nothing to lose. Just try it out.